Joining me now in the studio is Nabila Ramdani, a journalist specialising in Islamic affairs and the Arab world. Thank you for staying with us. Want to talk to you about NATO and their role in this conflict. We saw when that UN mandate was passed, perhaps a quick process for military operations to take place in Libya, and yet this stalemate unfolding. How do you think they are going to respond now to the situations that we're seeing unfold at the moment?
Well, it has to be said that NATO's role in the Libyan conflict has always been quite controversial. It was very clear that the UN resolution 1973, which was passed, its official aim was to protect civilian lives. But of course, the end game was always about regime change. And NATO made its mission to lead the rebels to outright victory, providing them with all sorts of supports, financial support, but also, of course, strategic and tactical support, including arms supplies in clear breach of the UN arms embargo. It has also politically recognized the National Transitional Council, which is, let's be honest about it, a very eclectic, divided group, unelected, not representative of the Libyan population. So NATO's role has been quite controversial, and I think there will be immense pressure on NATO and the international community now in the post-Gaddafi era to try to bring peace and security to a very divided country where you have all sorts of resentments, rivalries and settling of scores, to be blunt.
Well, it's interesting to note that, excuse me, when the British Foreign Secretary William Hague talked in the initial days of that UN mandate being passed, that their job was to ensure a peaceful environment for the Libyans and not, as you've just explained, the end game as such. But he did also point out at the time that the divisions within Libya were going to become a sticking point for NATO members.
Very much so, and I think even now that we've seen the Gaddafi regime has been undone effectively, the outlook for NATO is not very easy, because in some ways after 6 months of bitter fighting, you have we've seen divisions and rivalries within the country, and it might mean that perhaps NATO will have to go on the ground to ensure peace and stability in the long term.
Really? You actually believe they will put boots on the ground?
I think that might be an option, but of course this is going to prove hugely difficult to convince the European governments that have been involved in the conflict.
Because they've always been very clear that their aim was not to have a military offensive on the ground, and under no circumstances did they want that to happen. And also members who reluctantly voted in favour of the mandate have said that's just not going to happen.
Yes, but they've also been saying all along that the end game in all that was not regime change, but effectively what we've seen is unconditional support to the rebels. So the UN resolution was drafted in such vague terms, in such broad terms, that it leaves room for any kind of interpretation, to be honest. And it might be that it could be a necessity in the long term.
So ultimately, a massive headache, as you're describing it, for NATO, but also, I suppose, in the wider context of the Middle East and the Arab world with these uprisings that have been taking place. How has their position in Libya perhaps strengthened or undermined their position in the political world with this?
I think what the Libyan adventure proved is that the international community has applied double standard to the turmoil in the Middle East. In Libya, it was very clear that Gaddafi was brutally putting down an armed rebellion. If you compare the situation with Syria, for example, we have a very nasty autocrat who's indiscriminately killing his own people, children, men and women, peaceful demonstrators. So it's much worse in many ways that what's happened in Libya. And
but some people have said that Syrians have had to pay the price for the stalemate and the NATO offensive in Libya. Would you agree with that? I think, and by that I mean because there has not been a clear message, as was the case in Libya in the beginning stages of the conflict.
To a certain extent, it proved difficult in the first instance to secure a UN resolution for Libya. And it has to be said that it's very much President Sarkozy of France, who was very much the hawk in all that, and he managed to convince not only European countries but also the Arab League to provide some support. And after the conflict started in Libya, the Arab League was started to be a bit a bit reluctant actually to as to what was happening in Libya. So it proved quite difficult to convince the UN Security Council to pass another resolution in this context of Syria. But you add to that the various geopolitical and geostrategic elements of the region, and that's what made the international community a bit reluctant to act on Syria.
Good to talk to you, Nabila. I think you're going to stay with us, so we'll speak to you again in a short while. But for now, thank you very much.